Well, welcome again to one of 4SA's in-house video casts. And we have a very interesting topic for you this week. We're going to be looking again at the critical importance of children's rights and the whole debate about where does parental rights end, where do children's rights begin, what are the issues that we are looking at, particularly with an increasing amount of state interference in parental rights. And we've had a very significant decision in the Supreme Court of the United States of America, known as SCOTUS, which has really flagged this and highlighted it, and we think has made a very positive contribution to this whole debate. And so this afternoon, we are with me, Michael Swain, the Executive Director of Freedom of Religion South Africa, and our Head of Legal, Liesl Pretorius. So, Liesl, maybe you can kick us off and tell us what actually happened in the USA and why is it significant for us here in South Africa?
Well, Michael, at the end of June, the Supreme Court of the United States of America, which is also known as SCOTUS for short, they ruled in a very significant case, the case of Mahmoud versus Taylor. And in that decision, they ruled that public schools must inform parents and allow them to opt out of curriculum content that conflicts with their religious or moral beliefs. So very, very significant. The court affirmed that parents are the primary moral educators of their children, not the state. And this reaffirmed the position that is held in both international and national laws. And precedents that have held for centuries, because it's just natural that the parent is the primary educator of their child. Perhaps viewers have heard this expression that parents have an inalienable right, which is a very strong way of putting it, to educate their child, to choose, what moral basis is suitable for their child's education, what is the kind of education that is best suited to their children, because this is a prior right. The prior right is a right that is not created by the state or a law. It is a right that naturally exists prior to the state, but the state only recognizes and protects that prior right. So it's very important that parents do have this inalienable right. And it's a global trend. It's recognized in international law, but it is significant that there's more momentum and we see more cases coming forward that just reaffirm this, because this right has been under attack. And of course, the SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States, its decisions are not binding on South African courts, but because it's such a high-ranking court, America's top court, it has a lot of persuasive value, even for other jurisdictions such as ourselves. And this is a very important case for parental rights in education, a critically important right, and of course a right that's very closely linked to the right to freedom of religion. And as we have said before in articles and other interviews, it seems when you're looking at international trends that we really are in a place where there is a battle for the hearts and minds of the next generation, not only overseas, but in South Africa too. And of course, parents have a critical role to play in this. Exploring further on that topic, Michael, what is the heart of this global trend? And in South Africa, is there any controversy on home ground also around education and parental rights, similar to what we're seeing overseas?
Yes, absolutely. As you correctly say, this is a global trend, and we are now experiencing this and have been experiencing this for a while in South Africa. There's a growing clash, rather, to who actually holds the authority to shape the moral and ideological worldview of our children. Now, very often, of course, this battle plays out in education departments, and the South African Department of Basic Education, or the DBE, has introduced, and this is something that we have been contesting for nearly 2 years now, a teacher training toolkit, which is called the ECE toolkit. And the challenge with it is this, that it basically trains teachers to introduce a culture of transgenderism into pre-primary and primary school classrooms. And this gender transformation education is being pitched at children, therefore, as young as literally, so 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. And this has not had any appropriate or meaningful parental consultation, and therefore it doesn't have their consent, and therefore effectively it doesn't have a legal mandate. But nevertheless, the issue here really at the core is who has the right to determine what values are instilled in young children during their most formative years. And of course, it's deeply problematic. We've had numbers of engagements now with the Department of Basic Education. We're actually hoping to have another one even in July to really challenge their refusal to allow for parental scrutiny, let alone opt out, and to highlight the erosion that is taking place both in transparency and in the constitutional protections which must be granted, we contest, to family, particularly for parents, as Liesl said, to be able to pass on their religious views, their faith, their views, their values to their own children. So, Liesl, back to you on this one, because this is the legal question. Can you tell us about this Supreme Court case and the relevance of it in our South African context?
Of course. So the judgment was handed down on the 27th of June, 2025, fairly recent, by the US Supreme Court, or SCOTUS. And as I mentioned, not binding on South Africa, but definitely persuasive value. The United States is also a constitutional, also has a constitution, strong protection of constitutional rights, religious freedom, etc. So it's a case of Mahmoud versus Taylor. And as I briefly mentioned, public schools, it has now been ruled, they must inform parents when you have this kind of content that impacts on the religious and moral beliefs. And parents need to, in addition to being informed, they need the option of opting their children out if this content conflicts with their moral and religious views. And basically through this, the court affirmed that parents are the primary moral educators of their children, not the state. And as we've touched on before, this really is the heart of this battle for the next generation. But we are not only seeing it in the US, we're seeing it in South Africa as well, as you've also now touched upon. Getting to the DBE, the EC toolkit, for example, the DBE has claimed that the toolkit is optional, it is not mandatory, it is merely a supportive material for teachers, is a teacher training material that's supportive. But in reality, you look at the kind of policies and structures, it could be argued that it functions as an indirect or a de facto policy. So teachers are trained using this DBE endorsed content. And what are the results of non-compliance? One must immediately ask, could it lead to professional disciplinary action, for example? And that would put a lot of pressure on a teacher. And the toolkit is also embedded in early childhood education frameworks, and it's linked to teacher development standards. So in a way, yes, technically, legally not compulsory, but perhaps practically unavoidable for many people in the public education space. And if that happens on a practical level, it's ideological assumptions then become part of your standard classroom instruction and culture. And that's very concerning because there hasn't been any meaningful public participation on this or involvement of parents, as you've touched upon. And you've also touched upon the age group, young children, 0 to 9. Why is this especially concerning, Michael?
Well, because 0 to 9-year-olds are literally at the most vulnerable developmental stage, and they can not, from just a cognitive or emotional development point of view, possibly evaluate the ideas that are being put forward. Well, your children just simply don't have the ability to discern the ideologies. They just take pretty much for granted, particularly from an authority figure like a teacher, that what they say is correct. And of course, we've also had, and this is, again, I think the pendulum is swinging a little bit, because there have been international studies like the UK's CAS review, and the US came up with an HSS report in 2025 as well, which actually warns specifically against gender identity instruction. Not only because there's just weak evidence that it does any good, but there's increasingly strong evidence that it can potentially harm young children. And teaching these contested gender theories to young children is basically nothing less than a social experimentation project. And again, here's the challenge. Elites often argue somehow that they are more qualified to determine what children should learn because, and again, this is very concerning, increasingly they see parents as uninformed or traditional or even bigoted or regressive. And, they invoke all these wonderful buzzwords like inclusivity and social justice to somehow legitimize their authority. But in practice, however, the results are that they're actually imposing ideological conformity on your children. And as a commentator noted, the most dangerous ideology is the belief that your child belongs to the state. And that is exactly the position, unfortunately, that our own Department of Basic Education is taking. They wrote to us when we were contesting this early childhood education toolkit, and they said that they see parents and children in an unequal power relationship. Well, what is that exactly? I mean, of course, parents and children are in an unequal power relationship because parents are clearly in that position of the guardians. They are the protectors, the teachers. They are their child's world in a very real sense. But of course, they see children's rights as somehow in opposition to parental rights. And what they then see themselves as is the champions of children's rights. And they acknowledged in their letter, yes, okay, parents do have the right to teach their views and their values to their children, but we have the right to teach them supplementary constitutional values. And that is deeply concerning because effectively what you're seeing these interventions cutting across the rights of parents to teach their children, contradicting what they want to teach their children. But of course, that all comes down to how do they see themselves, what is their role. And it was quite telling that one of the PowerPoint presentations that we saw had a little tagline, children are our greatest asset. Well, the answer is absolutely no, they're not. Children are not the asset of the state. They are very much belonging and under the covering and protection of their parents. So, yeah, Liesl, again, one of the challenges with all these things is how do parents respond? I mean, can parents even opt out of this? And if not, why not?
I think parents should really demand an opt out of it, especially since the toolkit is technically voluntary, but practically it might be very hard, as we've just discussed. But parents really need to be aware of what's going on and enforce that right and say, our school will opt out. And that's why school governing bodies are so important. But as we said, practically, often these things, implementation, it's linked to funding, and if it's embedded in a framework, it complicates things. Why, opt-out is a right. And it's a right that exists to protect children because parental rights protect children. But there are some who might see it as a threat, and one wonders why. Perhaps because, once one parent starts opting out, others might follow, showing that there isn't this moral consensus. If enough families dissent, this illusion of a universal agreement or of the fear of disagreeing disappears. So, yeah, I think it would be good if there's a very clear opt-out. One wonders why there isn't a clear opt-out. Could perhaps be argued because it's technically not mandatory, but it could be. But practically, as we described, practically it creates this idea, or practically it can act like a de facto policy. So it's also a very good thing to just write that in. It does no harm, and it protects parental rights, which in turn protects children's rights, because children's rights, as I said, nestled under parental rights. If for some reason anyone would very specifically try to stop an opt out role now, then that's very concerning, because that's an indication that it's not about inclusion. It's actually about control and pushing a specific narrative, which is not inclusive and which is, and that would be very concerning. That's why transparency and public participation and the protection of parents' rights are very important. It's only a threat to persons who might have hidden agendas, and that's why we want to see these things in policies and documentation that's being developed. And there are education departments. I've read about cases in foreign jurisdictions that have activists in their departments. And words, and you've touched upon this, words like inclusivity, inclusion, equity, anti-bullying can be misused to mark the nature of, to mask content that is actually ideological in nature, because nothing inherently bad about inclusion, nothing inherently bad about equity. Bullying must be stopped. These are things that people agree with. But sometimes a word can be misused or to hide that something else is coming in. Language that is used to disguise what might actually be a deep orientation of reorientation rather of a child's moral universe. So that's why often on the face of it, documents have words that, depending on how it's used or misused, can have very different outcomes, and you need to be aware of that. In some of the DBE's own documents, there's, for example, intention to challenge a harmful gender norm. Now, that depends on what is the harmful gender norm being challenged. If the harmful gender norm is that boys can be doctors and girls can only be nurses, yes, go ahead and challenge that. But it's the harmful gender norms that morals that parents teach their children that are linked to their sincerely held religious beliefs that is inherently harmful, then it changes. Then we need another discussion around that to see exactly what's going on, because you don't want things open for abuse. And you definitely, it is of great concern when this could be misused, to contradict or challenge a child's family, their culture, and their religion, and using other words to kind of disguise what is actually happening there. Because true inclusivity makes space for different views. So, Michael, talking about inclusivity, then, what is your reading of it? Is this really about inclusivity, or is it about enforced belief?
Yeah, no, I think you teed it up very well. True inclusivity does respect all views, and that would include, of course, religious views and cultural views. But to do otherwise, of course, actually isn't inclusivity. It's imposing some form of coercive conformity. And I think, unfortunately, and increasingly, families with traditional beliefs are dismissed or are seen as being somewhat regressive. And even teachers who may express their concerns risk potentially facing professional sanctions. So, what is the net result of all this? Well, children are actually being subtly taught that their family's values may actually be outdated or even harmful. Again, in this ECE toolkit, they are training teachers to not use the he and she pronouns in classrooms anymore, but to rather use they and them, because as the manual says, you want the child to know that you cannot tell whether somebody is a boy or a girl simply by looking at them. And they're also being told to say to children, look, if your mummy and daddy are saying that there are only men and women and boys and girls, well, that actually might be even harming you and holding you back in life. Now, that is not education. That is indoctrination. And, the South African Constitution actually protects the best interests of the child and religious freedom and public participation in education. Yet this is effectively all being overridden. What we're seeing here is the DBE, through this ECE toolkit, introducing an ideology with really no legal authority because parents haven't been involved and parents haven't been consulted. And worse, one of the things that we suggested, and this is where I think you can see, are we really trying to be inclusive or not? One of the solutions that we put forward is we said, look, why don't you establish within the Department of Basic Education a parental rights or family values and parental rights unit so that you can truly take all views into account when you're developing this type of content, because they actually already have a unit there called the Social Cohesion and Equity in Education Directorate. So they've got the social inclusion and equity in education, which is obviously pushing very much this type of ideology. But when we asked them, well, let's balance it out, the answer was absolutely not. You don't belong here. You belong in the Department of Social Services. Well, if one belongs in the Department of Social Services and Development, then so does the other. You can't actually play it both ways. But of course, that's exactly what's happening. We're seeing this double standard, which suggests indeed that there is an ideological bias and not an educational balance. And that's really problematic. So Liesl, maybe tell us what are these potential consequences that are happening or that are likely to happen if the DBE continues down this path?
Yes, I think there are several concerning potential consequences. And just backtracking a bit to these units, if the DB goes down this path, it will undermine social cohesion because it creates a division between parents and the state and parents and teachers. And you really want cohesion. And but you have to have it in a way that respects diversity and accommodates difference. And that includes religious views and cultural differences. And, we have a wonderfully diverse society. Our constitution celebrates unity and diversity, not unity and in conformity. And the rejection of the family values and parental rights unit is concerning because there's a strong international law basis for that in the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child that says that the education of the child shall be directed to maintaining or fostering positive African moral values. So there's a strong basis for that in international law or for a parental rights unit. But yes, what other potential consequences could there be if the DBE continues down this path? Religious and other parents, because it won't only be religious parents, it could be parents of certain, more traditional cultures or any person who doesn't agree with certain ideologies. They might consider withdrawing their children from public ECD centers. And this could harm access to education. It could harm the livelihoods of the educators in these centers. But more fundamentally, it risks rupturing the trust between schools and families and creating division in communities. And that's not what we want in South Africa. We want true social cohesion that recognizes and respects difference. And children, what if children are kept in these schools and this toolkit is implemented? They might become alienated from their parents, which is very traumatic and confusing to a child. It certainly cannot be in the best interest of a child. And when they may be in the situation where they're unsure, should I believe my teacher? Should I believe my parent? And that is a recipe for confusion. It's definitely not a recipe for social cohesion. Now, even in secular education, it's very difficult to get an education that's completely value-free. And that's exactly why parents have the inalienable right, as we've discussed earlier, to choose the value system to pass on to their own children, to choose which type of education system is best for their children. And in terms of South African education policy, that includes the religious, the cultural, and the language basis of a child's education. And the state has a duty to support parents. The state has a duty to support the family unit, not undermine it. That is also very strongly protected in international law. So then the question is, why do state authorities exclude parents from seeing or challenging values that are taught to their children, including disregarding their right to opt out? And why is it then, if the state says, no, we're not trying to do that, then why not actively create an opportunity for meaningful engagement? Why not set an explicit, you have the right to opt out? Because many parents, they don't know about this toolkit, and there wasn't, any meaningful public participation in its development. And we've asked for these opportunities, and the answer has been consistently no. So that is concerning. But we are continuing, hoping to engage, as you've mentioned, and hopefully even in July, because really the end goal is to try to work together to get a solution that is in the best interest of children, that protects potential rights, and that aligns with the Constitution and protects or honors our democratic principles, our rich diversity that we have in South Africa. And I think this brings the discussion to an end, Michael. But before we go, can you give viewers a bit more information if they want to learn more about this issue, if they want to stay informed about the work that 4SA does? Where can they go?
Yes, I think particularly it's so important that parents do understand what their rights are, and particularly their rights in the education system. And this is something which we 4SA have always worked on. We're going to be actively working to an even greater level of focus to make sure that parents understand what your rights are in the education system in South Africa. And the best way to follow us, of course, is to go to our website, which is www.forsa.org.za. That's forsa.org.za. You can, of course, sign up for our newsletter there. You can also follow us on Facebook, Freedom of Religion SA. We have a YouTube channel too, which is probably what you're watching now. But please do keep informed, keep engaged. Do not allow these things to just drift by you. It is so important. Ignorance is definitely not bliss, because literally the next generation is at stake. And we would ask you as well, please do consider how you could support and help 4SA to do what we do. We are entirely dependent upon voluntary gifts from people. So we would really encourage you to click that donate now button on our website and make a contribution so that we can stay in the front line in the fight for faith and freedom. God bless you.
Good day. This is Nobukosi Zulu, legal advisor at 4SA. Remember to like and share this video and then click on the subscribe button to make sure you never miss our video updates on vital religious freedom issues.